Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Momentum Interview Series. My name is Mo, and we're going to be speaking to experts in their field. Today, I'm speaking to Francoise Brougher, the former COO at Pinterest and former global business lead at Square. Francoise, welcome to the recording. Where does this video find you?
This video find me in California. Thank you for inviting me. I should start there. Very excited to do this with you today.
Good to have you on board. So let's kick off with a totally easy question. What was the single biggest challenge of running a $15 billion ad operation at Google?
So you should know that when I took the business, it was not 15 billion, it was 8. And it was not growing very fast, but an $8 billion business to grow fast is a little bit harder. And the biggest challenge was to really restore the growth rate from 8% when I took it to 26% when I left the organization 4 years after I joined.
Wow, that is quite the growth rate. And I mean, the benefits to small businesses was likely very clear, but what were 2 or 3 objections that your team had to overcome to get them to come on board?
Yeah, so the first one, and I believe it's still the first one today, is when people start using AdWords, their first question is, I cannot see my ad. Where is my ad showing? So that's the most asked question. So one of the things we did, for example, is as soon as the ad is showing up on the page, we send a screenshot to the advertisers. But even this, they have a hard time to figure out where their ad's showing. The second obstacle for them is to really understand the performance. How is it working for me? And especially at the beginning, when they don't have sophisticated tracking tools like Google Analytics, for example, they can't figure out, is this thing working for me? And then the third one is often AdWords is a product that require to be optimized, like any ad product. It's not a product you can set and forget. So there's a lot of education going on. And over the year, and I know the team is still experimenting out there, you really try to do set and forget product. But the web is complex, as you know, internet changes every day, page change every day, so it's very difficult to do.
Okay, that makes sense. So, I mean, that's the ad side of things. Let's move back to, the internal aspect of running ad sales at Google. What were some operational changes that you brought in to improve that process?
When I took this sales team, it was interesting. I just realized there was still a lot of people then. There was like 1,800 people overall in my organization. They were not all doing sales, but many of them were. And it was interesting that I realized the salespeople were really spending time with what I call their favorite clients. So it's always easier as a salesperson to go and talk to someone you have good rapport with and they are a good client of yours. It doesn't generate incremental revenue. So the biggest change for me is to really was trying to understand how we develop a process to understand incrementality on a base of million advertisers and start focusing resources on developing this incremental revenue. I also push a lot of upsell and cross-sell. And also, more importantly, every salesperson has a portfolio of clients they need to reach in a quarter, and really also emphasize portfolio coverage. Everyone needs a call, not just your favorite client. So it's quite important to be very disciplined, metrics-oriented, and understand the objective you are trying to reach, which in this case was, of course, incremental revenue.
Nice. So let's talk a little bit about your time at Square. When you were global business lead at Square, part of your job involved liaising with multiple stakeholders, something that many deal desk managers also do. What are some helpful tips to navigate this that you can share with us today?
Yeah, so I think the earlier you can share, the better. I think it's always hard to onboard people in your ideas if you share at the end. And it's something that people like me have a hard time because I'm an introvert. I want to make sure everything is well done before I actually put it out there. I think it's a mistake. I think earlier is a better. Let people give you some inputs, make them part of the process. Iterate many times is also very important, and continue to repeat. Someone at Google, like an executive, was always telling repetition doesn't hurt the prayer, and I really believe it's true. I think repeating, this is the way people actually learn and internalize the content. It's also okay to be proven wrong. I think there is something that also I learned as I get older is not to be too attached to your own idea. sometimes it's great to have conviction, but also, sometimes it's also good to let it go.
And part of your role at Square focused on building partnerships with big merchants to drive that company growth you were talking about earlier. What are 2 or 3 key aspects of that strategy that would be helpful to B2B businesses today?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, as I said, I'm an engineer by degree, so I like to think things about in a way of thinking about systems. So I'm generally much more comfortable managing millions of advertisers that you have to manage through a system and a process. I think the big deal are harder for me, but I learned a few things over the years. One of them is really not to put all your eggs in the same basket. I think these big clients are sometimes really difficult to close or take a long time. They are great to have because they can be marquee clients that you can use in your PR and communication as a proof of concept. You are able to scale. So it's a great showcase, but you have to be flexible. You have to be very realistic on how much burden you are going to put on your own development team when you sign these clients, because they often require custom development. So always have this mind, yes, it's a big client, then they're going to help me get clout in the market. But the more you can standardize learning, it will help down the road create scale.
During these sales and deal desk negotiations, what's the one North Star that drove your team's efforts, the criteria that they were focused on delivering on?
Yeah, so I think it's all about time. You really, when you're in sales, you have to think about timing and velocity. So the things I measure is time from discovery to sign, time to implement, because sometimes, it happens, the deal is signed, and then it takes another weeks or months to actually make sure the client use the product. So it's not finished when you sign. In some complex products, I have chosen in the past to have a different implementation team. For example, when at Square we were starting big merchant, one of the things we wanted to make sure is that download all their SKU into our system. So we had a very dedicated team to do this. So everything you do, you build, you really have to optimize for time.
So you currently sit on the board of Sodexo. Tell us a little bit about the company and the mission that it's trying to accomplish.
Yeah, so it's a very, very, very different from a technology company. One, it's a European company. And, I'm based in California, and all my career was in California. It's an older company, and it is in the food and service business. Very, very different. So that would be appeal to me to join this board now over 10 years ago. The other appeal, it's a company that had over 400,000 employees, and everyone tried to be a micro entrepreneur. So even if it's not tech, there was this culture driven by the founder of being a very entrepreneurial place. And I think it's nice to see that when this happened in a sector that is different from technology. The mission is hard to define because we're still working on it. It's something that the board, as a CEO and the board have taken on this year, not just the CEO, but really the team. But the idea behind what we're trying to say is to show that Sodexo is with the people at every step of the way in their life, in their days. They provide good nutrition. They provide a nice experience at school, at work, in hospital. It's really a B2B business, but at the end of the day, understanding the customer evolving need is critical to the success of Sodexo.
So which of Sodexo's offerings have proven to be the most popular over the years, and which ones are quickly gaining steam?
So that's one of the characteristics of Sodexo that is interesting. There is no standard offering. We are starting thinking about it because all the product is delivered on site. Is this million sites we have all over the world. It's a company that is in 80 countries. So the way you serve people in South Africa, where you're based, in California, in Europe, is quite different because it's linked to food and cultural habits and interaction with people. So we have a hard time to standardize. But at the end of the day, there is one thing that matters is what the consumer wants, that is most of the time not buying your product, but is supply your product by a client, which is Sodexo clients.
When you think about your current role at Sodexo, what do you spend most of your time doing? What keeps you up at night?
So, being on the board is so different than being on a team. And I had to learn this over the last 10 years is you have to be there as a coach, you have to be there giving advice, but fundamentally your role is twofold. One of them is to validate the strategy with your colleague on the board and the executive team. And the other one is frankly less fun, but you have to do it, is make the decision about hiring or firing a CEO. And that's also part of the job that you are going to be willing to take on when you accept a board seat.
And what are some trends in overall sales and operational management that companies should be aware of based on your time in the field?
I'm an engineer, so I really think about problem solving like a system. So I always have this bias that the more self-serve channel you have, the better. And the more people can interact with your product in an asynchronous way, the better, because they can choose the time at which they interact with your product. And when you think about global company, that's really necessary for you to have this global footprint. So that's one thing that I care about, self-serve, asynchronous. The other things I care about is simplicity. Not everyone really underestimates the power of simplicity, and it goes across your sales process. The pitch has to be very simple. The value proposition, what your product will deliver, is going to have to be very simple. And the product itself, or the widget and button, has to be very simple. So every time you are in a sales role, you have to think about simplicity. But it's also true when you operationalize your team. Every time you do things with your team, you need to think about standard and simplicity. I think most of the time people make things much more complex than they need to be. And it's okay to be on an 80-20 versus trying to get everything correct, but very difficult to understand.
Switching to culture for a little bit, what kind of culture have you tried to build at the different companies that you've worked at, and how's that been going?
Yeah, I always try to reach out for very diverse opinion because I think the reality of your consumer is very diverse. And by bringing more voice on the table, you have a chance to develop a much better product and a much better company. So being inclusive is very important to me. The other thing that I always strive on is a culture of transparency and direct dialogue. It's trivial to say that people are different from the issue, but often you run into situations that people take things very personally. As I explained before, it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to say, okay, here, I'll let you try this. I think healthy debate is important, but also is camaraderie. So I think when you do create this culture of transparency, it's very important also to balance it with a culture where people feel safe and trying to get to know people beyond the work. Really understand them, what is their life, where they came from, what motivates them. I think everyone is very different, and especially like me as I age, there is also the issue not only of gender and country of origin. I'm French working in the US, but also of now generation. I'm from an older generation. I'm lucky I have 3 kids, so it's helped me understand a little bit more. But it's important to really try to know people and create this opportunity, whether it's offsite, hike in the wood, or just have a side chat conversation. And I know it's harder today as everyone is remote, but everyone is different. And I honestly never met a person that come to work and say, oh, wow, today I'm going to do a really bad job. So your job as a leader is to manage them, and more importantly, to lead them to do their best work. I think being a good role model for the team is important too.
And speaking of leading and management, how has your own personal hiring process changed over the years? What's the top criteria you now look for in a candidate?
So the first one is intellectual curiosity, especially in technology. Everything changes every 6 months. And what I like is people that can see insight on what is going on around them. So when I do an interview, I generally ask a lot of questions about what they have done, and you can really differentiate people that have seen something happening versus people that have done it. So if I learn something new, something very insightful from someone that experienced something versus watching it, very important to me. So intellectual curiosity is important. The second one is, of course, leadership. Especially as our world becomes more complex and more diverse, I want to have someone that is a very good role model for the team. Is this person inspire people to do their best work? It's very critical to me. And then the third one that go with the two first is someone that is engaging, collaborative, fun, can really adapt to any kind of circumstance. I always said I love the person that I remember in consulting in my early days at 3 a.m. at the copy machine, still whistling, or that can find the project is really hard, but they can really find a diamond in the rough and a way to engage in a different way with the team. I think that's important. So the three are intellectual curiosity, ability to inspire and be a good leader, and being collaborative, fun, and engaging.
Let's take this now from a different direction. What character trait or statement that they might say in an interview would be an instant red flag for you?
Oh, if you are boring. It's really hard sometimes, and I have done, now I don't count, but having hundreds of interviews. And if someone, after you're there and after 10 minutes, it's not the right person, and you have to go through another 40 minutes and you are really bored, that's very painful to me.
And you mentioned earlier on about sitting on the board and the responsibilities that came with that. So as a member of the compensation and nomination committee of a 420,000 strong company, it's a lot of people. What are some of the key processes you've implemented to ensure fair and equitable compensation across the board?
So you are going to have to be very demanding in terms of the metrics you get. And I think Sodexo did a decent job at this, but you will need to look at level, at country, at gender, family job, and understand what is the pay rate, what are the difference between people, but not only just pay rate, you need to also look at career progression, who is moving up the ladder, who is not. And you have to have a team in HR that is really going to help you sharing honest, direct metrics and understand what needs to change. And at the board, especially when you have so many people, you need to have a systematic way to evaluate this. It's not perfect. I also think some companies have better system, including providing a place. There is some at Sodexo where people can really share in a confidential way how they feel about their compensation.
And for management teams leading companies at that size, what are some other major issues and potential cost centers to look out for, whether this is financially or from an HR perspective? I had
the blessing to be in tech, where it's not an industry that is very focused on costs, because there is so much scale in computing power. I think the things that are really important in tech is really understand your market share, especially when you reach a decent size. Is your market share growing? Are you winning? And it's critical to manage a company. Growth rates is so important. Diversification, where is the next source of business coming from? It's so important. So market share, growth rate, innovation are things that as a management team, you really need to pay attention from an external standpoint. Internally, tech companies are really talent driven, and it may take a while to erode talent because there was great people before you sometimes. But paying attention, which are the people you are actually retaining, promoting, who is succeeding in your culture, who are the leader of tomorrow? How do you identify them today? And it may not be the person you like the most or is the most easy to work with, but understanding the raw potential of people is so important, because then it's your role to develop them and make sure they reach their full potential.
It's also really important because the good ones never really stick around for long if they don't see any growth.
No, when things go wrong, they are the first one to leave. You really have to understand this.
So, I mean, you've
have
held
options. By definition, they have options. Yeah.
They absolutely have options. And I think also, if you look at the great resignation that's happening right now, combined with the fact that there's a lot of really great roles opening up and companies are struggling to hire the best talent, companies have to do as much as possible to keep the environment fertile enough for these ambitious workers to stick around.
Yeah, and what I love, by the way, about momentum, so as I'm on the blog on momentum, I just want to mention it, is you are in South Africa. I have talked to people in Argentina. I think being able to harness the power of global talent is going to be critically important moving forward. So it's exciting to see startup as early as momentum get into this discipline, because it's much harder to do it when you are with your sweet friend in a garage in Palo Alto than when from the get-go you are used to work across timeline, across culture. It's so important. So I'm actually very inspired by this.
I love that. And, speaking of garages and Palo Alto, you've held different tech leadership roles over the past 22 years, an amazing career run. What's one key insight about steering a company from the C-suite that most people don't realize?
I have seen executive in tech, and there is sometimes a little bit of ego around them. And I think it's very important that executives recognize they are as good as their team. And some of them do, to be honest. They really sit on top of their shoulders. They do well if the team under them are performing. Their job is actually to make sure that the team have what they need to perform, including, when you're an executive, one of your primary jobs is to clarifying things for people, help them figuring out. And you are an enabler. And it's hard sometimes for executives to think themselves as enabler, but that's the thing they are if they want to be successful.
One could almost say that the job of an executive is to simplify complexity across the board.
Yeah, of course.
Nice. What's been the most enjoyable aspect of your career so far?
Even so, I claim to be a super introvert. Working with many hyper talented people and really learning new things every day. So that's what I miss today. I'm no longer working full time, and I do miss this.
Would you say there's been a common professional thread between all your previous roles, or have they kind of vastly differed from each other?
I've been driven by learning new things. My first role after college, I went and worked in Japan. So because I didn't know Japan, I've never been there, and it was the 80s and Japan was booming. So I think the common thread is I'm someone that is very curious. I love learning new things. I love inventing the future. I try not to be too concerned by the little things, but focus on things that actually are going to move the idea forward. I try to be open. Sometimes I'm less. And try to have fun while still sometimes disagreeing. Consensus is not always the answer, but I think intellectual honesty, authenticity is always.
Some people work best as independent contributors and others as team players. Your own collaboration style, how has that changed over the years?
At the start of my career, I love to be an individual contributor because I grew up in a country that, I was a woman engineer. There was very few women in my class. So I should admit, very competitive. But coming to the US was very interesting to me because I really learned the power of problem solving in a group with a few people in the room. It's actually much more interesting. The solution is generally much better. And I learned this, and now I love this. Like my best work day, if you wish, is being 3 hours with a team in front of a blackboard and really laying it down and challenging each other. And so I moved from a very, I'm still competitive, I still want the team to win, but now it's a team versus myself. So it's a big change.
What's something quirky about you that most people don't know?
I think people see me, I'm very active, but actually I love sitting down and reading a good book, any kind of book. I just love human story, but I also, I'm used to devour fiction because I do like the future. And the other things I like, I also love architecture. That's something, again, I'm an engineer, so building things is something I like to do.
A bit of a curveball for you. Which architectural style are you most interested in? Which one do you love the most?
I like styles that mixed. So, for example, I like house that can be very rustic from the outside and very modern in the inside. I built one like this where I live. I like, I'm, Southern European, so of course I love the style of Southern Europe, but not too much the ornate style, but more like the farm style. When I think about my childhood, I think about all these little farm or, shepherd house, which I think are really beautiful and really integrate with nature.
So if you weren't working in tech and ops management, what would you be doing instead?
I think there is two things, and it's related to my stuff I love to do. Maybe I would be a creative writer. I actually like writing. It's very hard for me, but I like it. Or an architect.
If you ever do go the writing route, I'd be super interested in reading your work.
Yeah, you can. I wrote a blog. It's not that much fun and not that creative, but I wrote a very long blog.
If you were starting your career all over again, what's one thing you'd do differently?
I think none. As someone that lives with no regrets, I never look at stuff I cannot change. I'm laughing because my husband is the exact opposite. He always think about stuff he could have done better. Even he always said, I've been married now for 25 years, and sometimes he said, remember our first dance, as we mess up? I said, who cares? But it's this person, and I'm totally someone that care about, the dance I will dance on my kid wedding. So I'm much more future looking. Therefore, I have nothing I would have done differently.
I like that. Next up, interviewing Mr. Brougher for Momentum.
Yes. He's great.
He is great. I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Francoise, for making time for
Thank
us
you.
today. I've been speaking to Francoise Brougher. She's the former COO at Pinterest and the former global business lead at Square. Francoise, I wish you a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Mo. It was really a pleasure to meet you.